honourable friend. Look, our advantage, Mr. Speaker, derives from our people. We must attract, recruit and retain the best people drawn from the broadest diversity of thought, skills and backgrounds to ensure we meet the threats we face. That is how we make them the most operational capability we can in the armed forces of today, in the 21st century. We must therefore recognise this diversity and inclusion is not morally right, but it's also vital to that capability. We can debate how we do it, but it's still vital.
Can I just say, look, work with me. I want to work with you. You've done very long answers during this. Now we're into topicals. We've got to be short and sweet. Lots of members want to get in on both sides who failed to get in because of the long answers earlier. So please, let's work together. John Healey, briefly, I hope.
At today's COBRA meeting, will the Defence Secretary tell other ministers in other departments they're too often using our armed forces to bail out their own department's failures, especially when he's making further deep cuts to the Army? And will he tell the House now, in addition to those deployed on overseas operations, which he's mentioned, how many of our forces will be deployed or on standby over Christmas in response to requests for military assistance he's already agreed to?
I'll do the right honourable gentleman a deal. I'll raise that at COBRA if he tells his union paymasters to not go on strike over Christmas and not ruin the lives of our soldiers and sailors.
Olin Mumby-Croft.
Can I welcome the steps the government is taking to support the British shipbuilding industry? These ships will, of course, require a lot of steel. Does he agree with me that wherever possible we should be using the world-class steel we make in this country in projects like these?
Such a fantastic champion of steel, and I absolutely agree with her. The support ship competition winner has indicated it intends to use UK-sourced steel whenever practical to do so, and in any event for the majority of the build.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much noise was made over the summer of the government raising the defence budget to 3% of GDP. This is now transformed into the Secretary's accepting a £2.3 billion real terms cut to the defence budget. Do ministers now accept that this cut will have a negative impact on recruitment, training, family support and pay for our armed forces personnel?
Accept his figures. Secondly, I've been given, between now and the budget next year, I've been given enough to insulate us from the effects of inflation, and we will be able to continue within our current comprehensive spending review envelope. We can discuss the next one as it comes up.
In Saxby.
Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that our different cadet groups do great work inspiring the next generation? And would my right honourable friend join me in congratulating P.O. Mack for his ongoing work with the excellent Ilfracombe Sea Cadets?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Our cadet forces do a wonderful job and I congratulate P.O. Mack.
Kenny McCaskill.
Last year, during a British Army exercise at the Waldega training camp in Kenya, a fire was caused, which is now seeing 6,000 Kenyans seeking compensation. I appreciate that the Minister may not be cited on this, but can I ask him if he will ensure that the Army's investigation into this is made public, and especially if firearms, explosives or drugs are involved?
Minister.
I'll write to him.
Sir John Whittingdale.
While welcoming the air defence equipment that is already being supplied to Ukraine, does my right friend agree that Ukraine needs to strengthen its air force as well, as my right friend for Uxbridge suggested? And will he consider extending the security agreement with Sweden to allow it to supply its Gripen aircraft to Ukraine and also to look at training Ukrainians in its use?
Well, first of all, we're grateful for Sweden. Sweden are here in the UK training Ukrainian ground forces with us up in the north of England. They're one of the contributing countries. As far as whether Sweden wishes to donate aeroplanes, that is genuinely a matter for the Swedish armed forces. But I do hear the need he is trying to tap into, and we're doing everything we can to work to solve that.
Grant Davis.
You mentioned the lack of long-range missiles in Ukraine earlier. Is there what capability has Ukraine got by way of drones to take out missile sites from Belarus that are illegally targeting civilians in the Ukraine?
Ukraine has shown itself to be the masters of innovation and have already developed a number of long-range drones that are having an effect. I think the real question here is scale and the numbers compared to the numbers that Russia are buying from Iran, and we need to make sure that's overmatched.
Mr.
Speaker, defence accommodation maintenance contracts that work on a fix-it-when-it-breaks basis ignores preventative maintenance, creates perverse incentives. The longer you leave a repair, the greater the damage, the bigger the cost. and too often remove the ability of accommodation users to look after their own homes. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's time we looked again at these contracts?
Grateful to my honourable friend, sympathetic to what he has to say, and he can be sure that my honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham, and I are looking very closely at the FTIS contract right now.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Charities like the Excellent Forces Employment Charity, through to brilliant sector specialists like Veterans into Logistics, are stepping up to provide structured career paths for ex-military personnel. But what they lack is consistent national funding. How will the Minister address the funding support that they require?
The Honourable Lady, she will, I hope, be aware of the career transition pathway, which is an innovation that's easing the passage of people from the armed forces into the veteran community. Let's be clear, most members of our armed forces transition perfectly well. Some need help, and the career transition pathway is designed to do that.
Al McCartney.
Thank you, Speaker. And can I compliment you on your military-grade haircut and refer members to my register of interest? Lincoln, just cheering you up, Speaker. It's Christmas. Lincoln as a city, including Lincoln College and its RAF-linked academy, has a concentration of innovative defence technology firms, due in no small part to RAF Warnings and being a part of my constituency and the historical links to the military, and particularly the RAF across the county. What steps have been taken by my right honourable and learned friend in his ministry, or are taking place soon, to allow those industries, in some cases small businesses, to survive, grow and thrive in this competitive arena?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right. Innovation is absolutely essential, and we are supporting through things like the Defence Accelerator and Defence Technology and Exploitation Programme all the plans we need to give us that competitive edge and to ensure that we stay one step ahead of our opponents.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Department's own figures, 45% of military personnel in single accommodation in Cheshire are living in substandard accommodation. And nationally, that's 4,000 families. It's appalling. Are these really homes fit for heroes? And what's the Minister going to do about it?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I don't recognise those figures. What I do recognise is the fact that 90% of people living in SFA live in homes that are at or above the government's decent home standards. MOD aspires to decent home plus. It's investing this year alone £176 million in upgrading service family accommodation.
Baines.
Speaker, my constituency of Clwyd South has welcomed Ukrainian families with open arms. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of the effectiveness of Ukrainian defence against the evil Russian forces who are invading the country?
As I read out earlier, the losses inflicted on the Russian army by a much smaller army and an army that is defending against aggression which doesn't have any basis on international law or respect of human rights is an extraordinary feat by these brave men and women. We will continue to support all the way through the next year, as will the international community, and it is vital that Putin fails in Ukraine.
Jarvis.
Christmas leave is precious, so I wonder if the Secretary of State, the Minister, could confirm that any serving personnel who are losing their leave over the Christmas period in order to support MAC-A commitments will be properly compensated.
Well, what I can say, and he will know this himself, because under both governments we've all been involved as former soldiers in, I'm afraid, meeting the consequences of strikes, whether that is the tanker strikes, whether that is fire strikes, or whether it is what potentially ambulance strikes that is approaching. Yes, soldiers and sailors would prefer to be doing their day job of defending their country, but sometimes they are called upon when the unions put at risk the safety of parts of this country and do so over a festive period. So perhaps he could have a word with his friends on the front bench and ask them to get his unions to desist.
I really appreciated that.
Isn't it impossible for us to supply ever-increasing amounts of munitions to Ukraine and also to replenish our own munitions stocks without a significant increase in our present peacetime defence budget?
Well, one of the things that I'm very pleased to note from the recent settlement is an additional £560 million has been provided to replenish precisely those stocks. And I can say that the production lines to re-procure some of the very weapons that are going to go back onto British shelves are already running, and we will continue on that path.
Mr Speaker, I welcome the recent changes made to the service complaint system, including separating alleged victims from perpetrators during criminal investigations. But could the Minister explain how he plans to implement the latter in restricted services like the submarine service?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady who's done so much, Mr Speaker, to advance the cause of women in the armed forces. She will be aware of the 2 inquiries currently underway in relation to behaviour on submarines. I'm not going to prejudice the outcome of those. I expect them to make recommendations, and I'll report that to the House as soon as I can.
Mr Ray. Speaker, my right honourable friend will be aware of a resolution recently passed by the Russian Duma that no vessel, whether merchant or Royal Navy, should pass through the waters to the north of Russia without both permission from the Russians and Russian personnel on board. Will the Secretary take this opportunity of reassuring me that if a Royal Naval vessel of any kind wants to transit through the Northern Sea route, either above the water or beneath it, we will do so without let or hindrance from the Russian Confederation?
One of the international treaties with the most signatures on is freedom of navigation across all seas. The United Kingdom stands strongly behind that and will uphold it wherever that is, hence the reason we did that transit with HMS Defender in the Black Sea. We will do that wherever we are able to do it in accordance with international law, and we will not be intimidated by Russia or any other nation.
It's me that the armed forces will only achieve its full potential if it's as attractive as possible to neurodiverse thinkers, particularly with cyber. The need for unconventional thinkers has actually perhaps never been greater than it is now. This can provide challenges, though, in terms of the soldier first, making sure they meet the core competence physical tasks as well, as I recently found out when it took me 25 minutes to put a belt on at Sandhurst, also as a neurodiverse individual. Would the Minister outline what is being done to better attract the talents of neurodiverse individuals into the armed forces?
First of all, the services are leading on trying to look at exactly that unconventional route in. If we are to attract the people to the National Cyber Force and cyber, we're going to have to think in different terms than we maybe did 20 or 30 years ago. That is incredibly important. We need to be flexible, we need to be innovative, and we need to be modern.
Robert Court. Yeah, Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State mentioned Ukrainian innovation in the use of drones just a moment ago. Are ministers confident that in this country we have the right resources and regulatory framework in place to ensure that our forces can also benefit?
Secretary of State.
No, I don't, and I think we need to look at some of those regulations. Some of the things that hold us back, both in innovation and development and deployment, is our own regulation. Too much of that holds us back. The Ukrainians obviously don't have that consideration first and are making amazing steps forward.
That completes questions. I'll let everybody leave before we start the urgent question. Right, let's come to the urgent question. Shadow Secretary of State, West Streeting.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State if he will make a statement on the government's preparations on industrial action.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question, which I'm taking on behalf of the department as the Secretary of State is attending a COBRA meeting on contingency planning for industrial action in the NHS. And he also came before the House on this subject twice last week at departmental questions and then for the Opposition Day debate. Mr Speaker, we are all hugely grateful for the hard work and dedication of NHS staff, so we deeply regret that some union members have voted for industrial action. Our priority must be to keep patients safe. That begins with keeping the door open. The Secretary of State wrote to the RCN on Saturday asking for further discussions as a matter of urgency. At the same time, Mr Speaker, we're working with the NHS to minimise the disruption to patients if the strikes do go ahead. We're engaged with providers, professional bodies and trade unions to agree safe levels of cover should any action take place. In addition, this afternoon, ministers, including the Secretary of State, are attending a COBRA meeting which is focused on our contingency plans. Our plans draw on extra support from a range of places, including service personnel and the private sector, while we aim to minimise disruption, with the NHS already under significant pressure from the COVID pandemic and winter pressures. We remain deeply concerned about the risk strikes pose to patients. But I want to be clear, Mr Speaker, even at this moment of uncertainty, people must keep coming forward to get the care that they need. People should continue to use NHS 111 if they need medical help and dial 999 in the event of an emergency. For more routine treatment, hospitals will do everything they can to make sure planned procedures go ahead. But it is inevitable that any strike would mean some patients will have their treatment delayed and people will be contacted if their appointment needs to be changed. But, Mr. Speaker, it's our hope that patients can be spared from unnecessary and unjustified strikes. Industrial action is in no one's best interest, especially in this difficult winter. We've had constructive meetings with the leadership of several unions, including the RCN, Unison, Unite and the GMB, and we look forward to further discussions to find a way forward together that is in the best interests of the patients that we all serve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for granting this urgent question. The power to stop these strikes lies squarely with the Government and the Secretary of State. The Royal College of Nursing and Unison have said they will call off strikes this week if they are willing to negotiate with them seriously on pay. This is a reasonable offer of compromise that is surely too good to refuse. So what on earth are they playing at? After 12 years of Conservative government, patients can no longer get seen on time, staff have been pushed to breaking point, and they can't even be bothered to try to negotiate to prevent strikes going ahead at the worst possible time for patients and the NHS. The government should ask themselves why nurses feel they have to take industrial action for the first time in more than 100 years under a Conservative government, and ambulance workers are set to follow them for the first time since 1989. It should be obvious by now what the Conservative agenda is. They know that patients are going to suffer this winter and they have no plan to fix the problems of their making. So instead of taking responsibility for their failure, they want to use nurses and paramedics as scapegoats to avoid the blame. It is a disgusting plan, it is a dangerous plan, and it is a plan that will not work, because the public know the power to stop these strikes is in their hands, and if they fail to act now, patients will never forgive them. How many operations have already been cancelled? How does the Minister expect those on the waiting list to feel if their operations are cancelled because of their gross negligence? Can he tell patients which services will be impacted if these strikes go ahead? And isn't the Secretary of State embarrassed at Cobra today, asking the army to come in to clean up their mess? Even at this last minute, Mr. Speaker, it is not too late to prevent these strikes from going ahead. Perhaps the Minister can tell us whether the meeting with the RCN later today will involve discussions on pay, and if not, why not? Because that's all it takes. Just a few minutes or a few hours of talk can avoid strike action. Why won't they do it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that Labour is all over the place when it comes to strikes. They criticise ministers while admitting the union's pay demands are unaffordable. Now, the gentleman opposite and his party leader are too tied to their union paymasters to be on the side of patients. Now, he knows, Mr. Speaker, he knows that we have an independent pay review body, and it's important that both sides respect that independent body. An independent body, Mr. Speaker, whose recommendations we accepted this year's increase in full, meaning that over 1 million NHS staff have been given at least a £1,400 increase in their pay. And, Mr. Speaker, that is on top of a 3% pay rise last year at a time when the pay was frozen across the wider public sector. But, Mr. Speaker, the RCN, one of the unions taking action, is asking for an increase that is 5% above RPI. Now, based on the latest figures, that is an increase of 19.2%, or equivalent of 6.5% of the NHS budget. Now, to meet such demands, Mr. Speaker, we would have to take money away from clearing the elective backlog the honourable gentleman references, something that no responsible government would wish to do. Now, throughout this period, Mr. Speaker, we have always sought to have a balanced process. Now, those in the private sector will not be getting a 19% uplift, and there is a clear need to be fair to the wider economy. We've got to avoid inflationary pressures that would make us all poorer in the end. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to listen to colleagues' concerns, not just about pay, but about many other issues affecting the working lives of those in the NHS. We'll work with them to make those improvements in a range of areas, from working conditions to patient safety. Because we believe, Mr. Speaker, there is so much that we can agree on. Strike action is in no one's best interest, and we'll keep working so the NHS continues to be there for those who need it most.
Chair of the Select Committee, Steve Bryan.
Mr. Speaker, just with your indulgence, may I just send our heartfelt sympathies to the parents of the little boys who've lost their lives in the West Midlands overnight, and say thank you to the emergency services, many of whom will have been NHS emergency services, who I'm sure have done their best for those who they pulled out and those who they were unable to save. The Minister is right that we have an independent pay review process in this country, but it seems that we're coming to an interesting junction point on that. Either we believe in an independent pay review process or we don't. We can't be in a situation where everything's agreed until it's simply not, and then ministers are negotiating pay. That is not what ministers do. On patients, I'm glad the Minister mentioned at the end of his remarks, we must keep them as our focus. I have more information about my train services over the next few weeks than I do about health services. Is the Minister satisfied that patients have enough information about what is being affected and when, and how much that will impact on the backlog? Because I suspect none of this will help some of those workload pressures that are impacting our NHS.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I echo his comments on the tragic events in Solihull and the boys that lost their lives, and the heroic actions of those in the emergency services. He's also right to say that we have an independent pay review body. We either agree and accept that that is the process, or we don't. Now, on advice to the public, he's right, we have more to do in this space. Derogations are still being worked through, both with individual unions and trusts. Now, patients should continue to call 999 as normal if it is an emergency, if someone is seriously ill or injured. If they do not have life-threatening conditions, use NHS 111. Ambulances will still be responding to 999 calls. And if patients have appointments, please turn up unless advised to do so. But he's right to make the point about communications, and I'll be ramping this up when we know more about derogations.
SNP spokesperson, Steve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Scotland's First Minister has managed in one day to do what the Tory government could not. Agree with the nursing unions to call off planned strikes for this month. These NHS workers are the backbone of these countries. If they don't work, the country doesn't work. And if the country isn't working, it's broken. Britain is broken, isn't it? And Brexit has broken Britain, hasn't it? The Tories won't negotiate, and the Labour opposition spokesperson is branded by the BMA as hostile to unions, while in Scotland the strikes are off, and they're off permanently. Mr. Speaker, an offer of 7.5% has been negotiated and agreed, an 11.4% pay rise for the lowest across the board in NHS Scotland. Why is the UK government refusing to give a decent pay increase to public servants when they have all the financial power to do so?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. My understanding is industrial action in Scotland has been suspended, not cancelled, as the honourable gentleman suggested, but they have made a considerably higher offer, partly because a politician has got involved in pay negotiations, directly in contrast to the independent pay review body. And it'll be interesting to see if the First Minister of Scotland is going to do this every single year and go against the recommendations of their pay review body. Perhaps the honourable gentleman would like to confirm, I appreciate you can't do it now, Mr. Speaker, whether they've also looked at things like leave, working times. And I think it's important to stress one thing, Mr. Speaker, that for every 1% increase on the agenda to change workforce, that equates to around £750 million. That is £750 million that will come out of the NHS budget that we won't be able to spend on things like tackling the elective backlog, which is so important to people up and down the country.
We now come to tobacco.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our military actually enjoy stepping in when the government department occasionally cannot manage, such as with flooding and so forth, or on the rare occasions that a strike may take place. But what we're seeing here this month is unprecedented, with so many sectors choosing to strike exactly at the same time. This places a huge burden on our armed forces. Could I ask the Minister, firstly, are all the units that may be required to mobilise, have they been informed already? And is it now time, if we are going to see strikes on this level, for minimal service levels to be introduced by departments to make sure that our armed forces are not overwhelmed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, representing a garrison city of Colchester, I have nothing but the utmost respect for our armed forces. And it hasn't escaped my notice, Mr. Speaker, that many of whom are on lower pay than NHS staff will be giving up their time over Christmas to cover strike action. But my right honourable friend is right. To mitigate the impact of planned industrial action with the ambulance sector, the NHS England have explored a range of measures. This includes engaging with the MOD on military sport, and as a contingency, Mr. Speaker, a MACA request for a limited number of personnel has been submitted to the MOD. It was submitted at the end of last week, and the plan is, Mr. Speaker, that MOD personnel will be trained to drive ambulances, but only deployed where they're needed across the country.
Mr. Speaker, the government needs to stop hiding behind the pay review body. The pay review body sorts out the distribution of the funding, and it's the government which determine the size of the envelope, and it's the envelope which is in dispute. So why won't the Minister get the Treasury Minister alongside him and make sure they negotiate on the size of the envelope, because if they can afford the member for South West Norfolk, they can afford a nurse.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the average pay settlements in the private sector range between 4 to 6%, and we want to have a fair deal for both NHS staff and the taxpayer. Now, the Honourable Lady makes reference to the pay review bodies, but important to stress, Mr. Speaker, they are made up of independent experts. They recommended the uplift for NHS staff, and in formulating their recommendations, the review bodies carefully considered evidence from a wide range of stakeholders, including NHS system partners and trade unions. The independent pay review body is a respected mechanism. We should accept their recommendations, which we have.
Can I commend my honourable friend on his statement and say how much I agree with him? Can he set out his thoughts on how things would likely proceed in the NHS every winter, were we to end up in the scenario which the Shadow Secretary of State appears to wish us to, whereby ministers negotiate directly with unions for pay each winter? And does he think that would lead to an upward pressure on pay at the expense, crucially, of the public who we serve, who need those operations, who need the elective care that we have budgeted for, and for that not to be eroded by unrealistic pay demands of 19%?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is right. We have an independent pay review body mechanism for a reason. It has worked for a number of years, and he's right. And this is why I made reference to the First Minister of Scotland. Is this a procedure we're going to go through every single year when a pay review body recommendation comes forward and unions don't like them, and then politicians have to get involved? The point of the independent pay review body is it depoliticises the issue, and you're not having ministers directly negotiating with unions. You have that independent pay review body that looks at the issue in the round along with the wider economy and a number of other factors, and then forms a recommendation that then the government can either choose to accept or refuse to accept. And it's important to stress, Mr. Speaker, apologies, in this case, the government accepted the recommendations in full.
Paulette Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was a nurse for 25 years. Nurses work long hours, day in, day out, to support people all over the country, often on very low pay. I know from experience how tough it can be, and it's shameful that many hospitals have opened food banks, especially to feed their staff. Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear. The power to stop these strikes that even nurses themselves don't really want lies squarely with the government. How can ministers justify refusing to talk to the unions?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question and for her service as a nurse. And we hugely value and appreciate all of our NHS staff. We've given them a pay rise this year on top of 3% last year when pay was frozen in the wider public sector. And as I've said just a handful of times, Mr. Speaker, we accepted the independent pay review body's recommendations in full. Of course, I don't want to see anybody, Mr. Speaker, needing to use a food bank, let alone a member of our NHS. That is exactly why the government has a broader package of support in place. But I have to take issue with one comment the Honourable Lady made. She said the power of the hand is who holds the power in terms of calling off these strikes. It is only one, Mr. Speaker. It is the unions.
Croft.
Mr Speaker, I've been out on shift with my local ambulance service. I've seen how hard they work and how important what they do is. We are really grateful for what they do. My constituents are worried. Can he confirm if the ambulance strikes go ahead, which categories of call we will ensure are responded to?
I thank my honourable friend for her question. We are currently having those derogation discussions with the unions. They'll also be happening at an individual trust level. As my honourable friend will know, having been out with her trust, 999 calls are triaged and categorised from Category 1 to Category 4, and on days of ambulance strike action, it's likely that Category 1 and Category 2 calls, where there's an immediate threat to life, will be responded to, and we are looking at ways in which we can provide additional support for Category 3 and Category 4, including things like block booking taxis and things like support through community healthcare and local authorities for fall services and community support.
Karen Smith.
Speaker, thank you. What we've got is a government that refuses to govern. Retention and sickness rates were reported in June 2019 to the Health and Select Committee by Health Education England as higher than average, and that if retention rates were kept at 2012 levels, we would have had 16,000 more nurses in the system. The Minister today talks about safe levels of cover during the strike, but the unions have told us that when they're looking at staffing levels, in some places they are currently below what is safe. Now, the issue for us as members of Parliament and our constituents is that none of us know whether our local systems are safe or not safe. So can he tell us today which hospitals across the country does he think are currently operating at safe staffing levels and which are below staffing levels before the strike even starts?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. She talks about NHS staffing levels, Mr Speaker. We have 1.2 million staff within our NHS. We have, compared to last year, 3,700 more doctors, 9,100 more nurses, and since 2019, 29,000 more nurses and 2,200 more GPs. But we do have high vacancies, Mr Speaker. That's why it won't have escaped the Honourable Lady's notice that we have commissioned NHS England to publish a long-term workforce plan, and that will be independently verified as set out by the Chancellor in the autumn statement.
Mr Speaker, inflation is the real enemy here because it makes us all poorer, and we've got a choice, a political and economic one. We either tackle it or we give in to an inflation pay spiral. Now, the Minister was quite right to mention that the Royal College of Nursing pay demands are in excess of 3 times greater than the average private sector payment at the moment. Does my honourable friend agree that public sector pay demands of almost 20% would embed inflation for years to come and make us all poorer?
Well, Mr Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Granting double-digit pay rises would sustain higher levels of inflation and have a bigger impact on people's income in the long term, as my honourable friend rightly pointed out, as well, of course, Mr Speaker, as eroding the value of savings, something very important to many of our constituents.
Margaret Greenwood.
Mr Speaker, these strikes are not just about pay levels, they're also about patient safety. NHS workers care deeply about their patients, and I stand in solidarity with them. Members of the Royal College of Nursing have told me how stressed and burnt out they are because they do not have enough colleagues to work alongside them. This is dangerous and extremely unfair on both patients and staff, and it's a result of failure of consecutive Conservative governments to provide enough resources and training places and to carry out the necessary workforce planning. The Minister mentions the independent pay review body, but he knows full well that there's a role for government in ending this dispute. So will his government get around the table with the unions and avert strike action?
Well, Mr Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right that this issue is about more than just pay. That's what the unions are telling us. It is about things like staffing levels and working conditions. Well, if that is indeed the case, Mr Speaker, let me repeat that my door is always open, and I would be very happy, as would the Secretary of State, to discuss those issues with the unions at any point they'd like to.
Dr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would there not be more money available for relatively poorly paid frontline NHS staff if there were fewer layers of management bureaucracy who are paid at substantially higher rates within the NHS?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for that question. Sometimes it does stagger me, the number of people within our NHS who are on six-figure salaries. However, with an organisation the size of the NHS, management is also important, and it's about getting the balance right. But we always continue to, my honourable friend Chunters from a sedentary position, the balance may not be right, and we always continue to look at the ratio of management to frontline staff to make sure that we're getting that right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government will blame anybody and everybody for these avoidable strikes, but he knows full well that the RCN is not even affiliated to the TUC, let alone the Labour Party. So if these strikes go ahead, it is the Secretary of State to blame, because he has the power to sort this mess out. Why doesn't he just get on with it?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman puts it in his usual blunt way. The pay review body process is the established mechanism for determining pay uplifts in the public sector outside of negotiating multi-year pay and contract reform deals. Now, despite what the honourable gentleman says, industrial action is a matter for the unions, and we urge them to carefully consider the potential impacts of industrial action. The Secretary of State has been clear, I have been clear, that our door is open. We've already met with the unions, and we'd be happy to do so again.
Lee Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, in 2014, the Shadow Health Secretary said that he supported strikes within the NHS, even if there was a Labour government in power. But today is remarkably quiet on whether or not he actually supports the strikes, unlike the RMT strikes, which I'm sure he supports. Does the Minister think that the Shadow Health Secretary and the front bench are playing politics with this issue?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not one to cast aspersions on my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, other than to say this. I and the Secretary of State refuse to play politics with this issue. This is all about patient safety and ensuring that if industrial action goes ahead. Now, the honourable gentleman, again, from a sedentary position, Mr. Speaker, shouts negotiate. He shouts negotiate, but he knows we have an independent pay review body and process and mechanism. And it is important, Mr. Speaker, that we respect it.
Richard Ford.
Speaker, we simply cannot afford to lose any more nurses and valued NHS staff. We've already got huge workforce shortages. 40,000 nurses resigned last year, and there are more than 130,000 vacancies across the NHS. So cancelling Christmas for members of the armed forces isn't going to fix these problems. Can the Minister explain how paying nurses insufficiently and drafting in military personnel over Christmas serves to attract new recruits to the NHS and to the armed forces?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a bizarre question, because the only reason we're having to put in a MACA request is because the unions have called strike action over Christmas. But as he asks about recruitment and retention, let me cover off recruitment and retention. We're committed to publishing, as I have set out already, a comprehensive workforce strategy which will be independently verified. We've set out new pension flexibilities. And as I've said, Mr. Speaker, we've already recruited around 29,000 more nurses. We're on track to meet our 50,000 target, and we plan to boost international recruitment. But I hope, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, not just in the interests of our armed forces who will have to cancel, many of whom will have to cancel their Christmas leave, but of course in the interests of patient safety, will agree with me that we do not want to see industrial action taking place, and I again would urge the unions to meet with us to discuss a way forward.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is regrettable, I find, and I think most people do, that the opposition benches continue to use the NHS as a political football. It is the care of the patients, and if that side of the House doesn't think that this side of the House cares for the patients, they are living in another world. Can I ask my honourable friend, who's doing a great job, is it not time we all accept, even the opposition spokesman accepts, that the NHS needs a radical reform? Surely it is time for an independent body to look at this argument and make the NHS run far more efficiently.
Well, I mean, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. We're constantly looking at how we can improve productivity and increased efficiency within the NHS. We have an acute issue now, not just with winter, but also proposed strike action. The honourable gentleman, the Shadow Secretary of State, mentions that the NHS needs reform. We are undertaking reform. Is there further reform that will need to be undertaken? Yes, there will. And if the honourable gentleman has particular ideas, I'd be very happy to meet with him to discuss that further.
John Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the dark days of COVID, it was the NHS which gave us hope, not ministers partying in Downing Street.
Yeah.
Now the Tories seek to demonise the very NHS staff we clapped from our doorsteps because they have voted to strike. Overworked, underpaid, without a proper workforce plan, concerned for the security, the safety of patients, and forced to use food banks. Do not our NHS staff deserve at least a face-to-face meeting from pay negotiations with this government?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the honourable lady got the impression that I or anybody else was demonising NHS staff. Far from it. It is the unions that have chosen to bring forward this action. As I said, Mr. Speaker, I hugely value and appreciate all NHS staff. It's why, Mr. Speaker, we've given them a pay rise this year, on top of the 3% pay award last year, when pay across the wider public sector was frozen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Minister knows that there's no clinician in the land that really wants to go on strike. Many of them feel that this crisis has been coming for a long time because of the issues around morale and lack of workforce, which I've asked him about on many occasions before, and he keeps on saying imminent, I think, is when we're going to have the workforce plan in place. But that's not going to solve the immediate problems. One nurse said to me the other day what she's most worried about is that at any one time there are several 100,000 people in the country waiting for their test results, in particular in relation to cancer. How is the Minister going to make sure that people get their cancer results in time to be able to meet all the other cancer plan deadlines?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. I know his particular interest in this, and we are looking to ensure that as many NHS services as possible continue during strike days. His broader points about the pay settlements. The average pay settlements in the private sector are within the range of 4 to 6%. So within the private sector, it's 4 to 6%. And the uplifts strike a careful balance between recognising the huge importance of public sector workers, but whilst minimising inflationary pressures and, of course, having an eye, Mr. Speaker, on managing the country's debt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister challenged back on who had the power to avert these strikes. Let me reiterate what my honourable friend said in his opening remarks, and that is that trade unions have been clear that strikes can be averted if ministers initiate face-to-face paid negotiations, which so far they've completely failed to do. So the power to stop these strikes lies squarely with the Secretary of State. How can the government justify refusing to even talk?
Well, I mean, Mr. Speaker, we've already been clear that we'd be very happy to meet with the unions, and I understand a meeting is being organised. But I mentioned it earlier, Mr. Speaker, but let's just reiterate this point in terms of what exactly the Royal College of Nursing are asking for. It is a 5% above RPI inflation uplift. Now, an uplifting pay for all staff, that's based on 19.2% within the agenda for change, Mr. Speaker, would cost around an additional £10 billion. Now, my right honourable friend talked about things like test results. You know, that £10 billion that we would spend on this is £10 billion that would come out of the NHS budget. That's £10 billion that we would not be able to spend on hugely important issues, Mr. Speaker, like, for example, tackling the elective backlog.
Right. Oh, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his answers? But can I just say, I was on the picket line with the NHS staff in Newton Ards and my constituency this morning. I don't expect to be reprimanded for that, by the way. I'm quite sure I'll be okay. But can I ask the Minister this question? for those NHS staff, and this is a positive, constructive question, Minister, those the men and women who were on the picket line in Newton Ards this morning at the Ards Hospital, all they want is a wage that helps them survive. The women and the men that I talked to this morning, Mr. Speaker and Minister, were not surviving. They were visiting the food banks. It's not just the nurses, it's the porters, it's the ward staff, it's everyone. Can I just ask the Minister this question? Would the Minister and the Government go just that wee bit further to get this settlement?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand why my honourable friend is asking that question, and I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but we accepted the independent pay review body's recommendations in full. As a result, over 1 million NHS workers were given a pay rise of at least £1,400. Newly qualified nurses, it was a 5.5% increase. Those on the lowest salaries, which my honourable friend referenced, are seeing a pay rise of up to 9.3%. And again, Mr. Speaker, this is on top of 3% last year when public sector pay was frozen. Nobody, Mr. Speaker, wants to see industrial action go ahead. My message to the unions are, it's good to talk, let's talk. I know the meeting is being set up. Let's do all we possibly can to avoid industrial action this winter.
We now go to the next urgent question. John Barron.
Ask the Minister for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs to make a statement on British Council contractors in Afghanistan.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Office Minister who is responsible for Afghanistan is travelling, my honourable friend from Aldershot, and I am a poor substitute, Mr. Speaker, but I'm most grateful to my honourable friend from Basildon and Billericay for raising this very important matter. Mr. Speaker, during Operation Pitting, nearly all British Council staff and some contractors were evacuated and offered resettlement through the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Policy, ARAP. Some British Council contractors plus dependents remain in Afghanistan and are eligible for consideration for resettlement under the ACRS, the Afghanistan Citizen Resettlement Scheme. The Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme will see up to 20,000 people from Afghanistan and the region resettled to the United Kingdom. It provides a safe and legal route for some of those affected by events in Afghanistan to come to the United Kingdom and rebuild their lives. The first year of the ACRS Pathway 3 is focused on eligible at-risk British Council and Garda World contractors, as well as Chevening alumni, honouring the commitments made by the government to these groups of people. The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office opened an online process on the 20th of June this year, 2022, to seek expressions of interest in resettlement from these three groups. They have played a key role in supporting the UK mission in Afghanistan, and it is right that we are honouring the commitments made during the evacuation to support those at risk. Up to 1,500 people from Afghanistan and the region will be referred for resettlement in the UK in the first year of Pathway 3, including eligible family members. The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office received over 11,400 expressions of interest, and these are being assessed in terms of eligibility. People are being notified of the outcome, and we are sending names to the Home Office for security checks. Once these checks have been completed, we will provide advice on the next steps to those who are being referred for a place on the ACRS. It remains, Mr. Speaker, a priority to honour the commitment made to eligible at-risk British Council contractors and to offer a route for resettlement in the UK under the ACRS. I would like to thank the Council for their excellent cooperation with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to date as we work together to resettle eligible contractors under ACRS Pathway 3. We are doing, Mr. Speaker, everything we can to bring the first British Council and other arrivals under Pathway 3 to the United Kingdom as soon as possible, where we will support them to rebuild their lives. Anyone who is eligible and resettled through the ACRS will receive indefinite leave to remain in the UK and under existing rules will be able to apply for British citizenship after 5 years in the UK. This is one of the most ambitious resettlement schemes in our country's history, and we are proud to offer a safe and legal route to those affected by events in Afghanistan.
John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. And let me start by welcoming the Foreign Secretary's speech on foreign policy this morning, which called for a long-term resilient approach that builds the long-term trusting relationships that this country needs for the future, and for underlining that this is precisely the purpose of the British Council, which has been building these connections for this country right around the world, quietly, consistently and effectively since the 1930s. I hope the Minister sees, as I do, the key role that the British Council can play in helping to achieve these objectives. But, Mr. Speaker, I make no apologies in raising this UQ. People's lives are at risk. I have been through the regular channels a year ago and was told that progress was being made, very much what the Minister has just said at the dispatch box. I raised it again in October, November, but there has been no response. The progress has not been made. For more than 16 months since Operation Pitting and the fall of Kabul, there remain around 200 British Council contractors and their families stuck in Afghanistan. And this has recently been highlighted in the media, many of them in hiding and in fear of their lives, unable to seek medical advice when necessary for themselves and their families. And family members have died as a consequence. British Council contractors are eligible, as the Minister has said, under the ACRS Pathway 3 scheme. Yet these 200 or so contractors remain stuck in Afghanistan because of a blockage of red tape here in the UK. Now, until this blockage is cleared, they will remain in danger, possibly rather, for a second Afghan winter. Now, since its launch in January, the scheme, the ACRS scheme, has not repatriated a single person out of Afghanistan. Those are figures, or if you like, no figures, but certainly confirmation of this that I've seen with the British Council. Not a single person has been repatriated under the RCS scheme this year. In July and August, an application window closed for the contractors to submit expressions of interest. British Council employees worked at pace with the FCDO to identify those that had actually worked with them, and yet still there has been no progress whatsoever. Having used all the regular channels, will the Minister now do all what he can before Christmas to clear these blockages and get these contractors back to the UK?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for what he has said, and he eloquently extols the brilliance of the British Council, Mr. Speaker. I had some responsibility for it 10 years ago, and I know very well that what he says about it is entirely correct. He's quite right about the eligibility, and we very much understand the urgency to which he refers. The pathway, this particular pathway process, of course, started on June the 20th and remained open for 8 weeks. The Foreign Office has looked at every single one of the applicants, and the process is moving through. And I would just say, although it's taking a lot of time, it is right that officials should look very carefully at each and every one of these cases. There's a balance to be struck, but I will ensure that his words today and his concerns are reflected across government as a result of this urgent question.
We now come to the Shadow Minister, Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the Honourable Member for Basildon and Billericay for securing this urgent question. He's been a great champion of the British Council in this place. Mr. Speaker, we know hundreds of British Council contractors are still stranded in Afghanistan following this government's botched evacuation from Kabul. Now, earlier this year, the Minister told the House that the government was, and I quote, supporting those in need, and that 50 British Council contractors had been evacuated. However, a recent report in The Guardian indicated that the government has not granted, as the Honourable Gentleman said, a single ACRS application since the programme was opened, not one. And furthermore, fewer than 10 staff are currently working on the scheme at the FCDO. I am contacted frequently by British Council contractors who are suffering terribly, and I'd be grateful if the Minister would allow me to raise these cases with him privately. Many of those that are still in Afghanistan are former security guards who protected British staff at the embassy, and they undertook an extremely difficult task during the evacuation in August last year. We owe so much to these courageous British Council contractors And the fact that they're still in Afghanistan and are facing daily violence and threats as a result of their cooperation with the UK is nothing short of a disgrace. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the last time I put these questions to the government, answers were not forthcoming. So I'm hopeful that this time I might be able to get some clarity. Can the Minister tell us how many former British Council contractors are still stuck in Afghanistan? What measures are being put in place to evacuate the rest of the British Council contractors still stranded in Afghanistan? What engagement he's had with regional partners to facilitate safe passage for British Council staff who attempt to leave? And what message does it send to other British Council contractors who work in challenging environments around the world if the UK government will leave them stranded in this way?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and he is quite right to express deep concern about those who are caught in this way. He asks me, Mr. Speaker, whether he may raise cases privately with me, and of course the answer is yes, and I will make arrangements for those meetings to take place straight after this urgent question is over. He asks a number of questions, and if I don't answer them fully, I will ensure that we write to him. But he is right to say that we keep in very good contact with regional partners and countries to try and advance this issue. This particular stream only opened, of course, in June this year. The Foreign Office has processed and is informing something in the region of 200 of those who are eligible in principle. And if the dependents are added to that, it's something like 750. So those are proceeding. And it is up, of course, to the Home Office to procure the necessary security clearance prior to them securing entry clearance. So the process is going on, but I fully accept his frustration. It's a frustration we all share in this matter. And as I say, perhaps we can proceed with a private meeting as he has requested.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't there a fundamental problem with talking about safe and legal routes for people who, if they expose themselves to the Taliban, are by that very fact going to be at risk? Last Thursday evening, I was at the Last Supper Gallery attending a photographic exhibition organised by the Sulh Alliance on behalf of Afghan interpreters, several of whom were there, including one who had been shot and another whose brother hadn't got out and had been murdered. The photographer, Andy Barnum, felt it necessary to anonymise the photographs because of the risks of identification. So doesn't the government have to come up with a better idea as how to extract people who are at risk as a result of helping us without them having to declare themselves openly and thus put themselves in more peril?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend, with great eloquence, makes a most important point, and there are various ways in which we can deal with this, which it would not be sensible to talk about across the floor of the House. But he makes very clear one of the big difficulties, and if it would be helpful following his meeting last Thursday, I would be very happy to discuss it with him.
SNP spokesperson Drew Hendry, and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I also congratulate the honourable member for Basil and Billericay for bringing this important question today. Mr. Speaker, it is morally indefensible that over a year after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, there are still innocent Afghans that worked for the British government and military that have received zero support from this government and the Home Office. So, can I ask the Minister, and I don't think it's acceptable to use terms like something like, exactly how many former British Council staff, including support staff, are still living in Afghanistan in fear of their lives and livelihoods? And can he clarify, when the government says it has brought 6,300 Afghans to, I quote, to safety, exactly what this means? How many of these are former British Council employees? The Taliban's so-called kill list is an active threat, and does the government know how many of its former employees are on this list? And finally, it is appropriate that 540 staff are working on Ukraine schemes, but if the government is taking this as seriously as it's supposed to, why is our figure showing there are a maximum of 8 people working on Afghan schemes?
Sir.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and the frustration which he expresses is frustration shared by many of us. I have to say to him that it is not possible to quantify the figures in precisely the way that he requests, but I will ensure that we write to him, giving him the closest possible approximation that we can.
Sir Mark Hendricks.
Mr. Speaker, on the 20th of January this year, there was an urgent question about British Council staff. I spoke column 506 in that urgent question, and I told the Minister of State for Asia at the time, the Right Honourable Member for Cannock Chase, that I have up to 150 constituents of relatives and friends who've worked for the British in Afghanistan and are in terrible need of resettlement to this country. The Arab scheme had done very little to bring many of those, if any, of my constituents back to the UK. And the ACRS, as we can see now, has done very little to bring any people at all to the UK. And at the time, I described the horrors that constituents of mine and relatives and friends who are working with the British were undergoing. The Minister at the time pointed out that the ACRS scheme was open and will prioritise, quote, those who have assisted the UK efforts in Afghanistan and those who have stood up for values such as democracy, women's rights, freedom of speech, the rule of law, as well as vulnerable people, including women and girls who are at risk and many members of minority groups who are at risk. We've seen now that Stream 1 wasn't open from Stream 3 wasn't open from January. It was opened in June. 6 months later, it's still not one person settled in this country.
To be sure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, he is there in his early part of his question. He was combining both the Arab scheme and the ACRS. And what I can tell him is that the prioritisation is precisely as my right honourable friend, the member for Cannock Chase, set out before. The pipeline is proceeding. This particular Pathway 3 started in June and was open for 8 weeks. The process is moving from the Foreign Office to the Home Office, and officials are handling these matters as fast as they can. It's very frustrating for all of us, but that's what's happening, and we will get there.
John Morrow.
The Minister knows that this government has legislated to make it illegal for anyone seeking asylum to enter this country by any means apart from safe and legal routes. And indeed, the entire moral basis, such as it is, for the claim that this government is meeting our international asylum obligation rests on safe and legal routes. Given that, how can he speak of pride in a safe route which is so manifestly and entirely failing, and failing those who are at risk of persecution because of promoting British values through the British Council? What does he suggest they do?
Minister.
Well, there may or may not be validity in the political debate on safe and legal routes that she is raising, but in this particular respect, there is a safe and legal route, and that is the one we are expediting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I disagree with the Minister that he is a poor replacement at the dispatch box for his colleague. I think he would bring a compassionate, informed and patriotic approach to this portfolio if it was his. But perhaps he could explain, instead of sending millions of pounds of taxpayers' money to Rwanda with nothing to show for it, why doesn't the government spend just a fraction of that money in expediting the safe evacuation of those who risk their lives to host and protect UK service personnel and civilians in Afghanistan?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind remarks. He is, of course, a distinguished soldier and brings that knowledge to the House, and he's rightly championed Britain's responsibilities in this matter. I would say to him that the government is both trying to advance through our strong partnership with Rwanda, and it's also trying to meet the other objectives he is setting. So I would commend to him the government's approach in both of those two respects.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister? He's well known for his compassion and understanding of these issues in this House, and I say that in all honesty, and he knows it, and I think everybody else knows that as well. But I want to ask the Minister a question. Will the Minister outline how many people have begun the ACRS scheme? Have their reference number given to them? In other words, were stand by, and yet have not heard anything in the last year during which the scheme has been in operation? And how can the Minister change this message that has been sent to those whom we ask to help us make the promises and then appear to abandon them when our aims are done? It is very, very sad.
Well, my honourable friend is quite right to point up Britain's responsibility in this matter, and we are, I think, meeting that responsibility. As I mentioned to him earlier, if you look at those processed by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and you add in their dependents, who are, of course, equally eligible to come in under this pathway, you get up towards something like 750 who have been initially processed, and it now moves to the Home Office. But he will understand that that is nearly half of those who would be expected to arrive under this pathway. We must do better, Mr. Speaker, and we are doing everything we can to make sure that we do.
Right, that completes the urgent question. We now come to the programme motion. Minister to move. The question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Trade Australia and New Zealand Bill, not amended in the Public Bill Committee, to be considered. Now.
No, that's great. We start with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider the other new clauses and amendments as on the selection paper. I call the opposition's spokesperson to move new clause 1. Shadow Minister, Gareth Thomas.
I rise, Mr. Speaker, to move new clause 1 and the other new clauses and amendments tabled in my name and that of my honourable and right honourable friends. We made clear, Mr. Speaker, at second reading that we want to see real and meaningful increases in trade, and particularly with two of this country's greatest friends and allies, Australia and New Zealand, both led now so ably by progressive Labour administrations, and that therefore we wouldn't oppose this bill. Trade, after all, is fundamental to this country. It's part of what being British means, and it will be a vital weapon in our armoury to tackle the economic crisis this country faces, and which the incompetence of the party opposite has so greatly deepened. We also made clear, as others have also done, on both sides of the House, that there are significant concerns about the consequences of the slapdash way these deals, particularly the Australia deal, were negotiated by ministers. I'm told Canada is already using the precedent of the Australia deal to press for similar access for their farmers. So these amendments are needed to mitigate some of the impact of those mistakes ministers made, to try to make the best of a bad job. In committee, I'm afraid there was little attempt to acknowledge or indeed apologise for those failings. And nothing since, Mr. Speaker, suggests that ministers at the Department for International Trade have learned the right lessons. Indeed, the recent detailed comments by the right honourable gentleman, the former Secretary of State for the Environment, now freed from the burdens of office and therefore the requirement to cover up for his colleagues, confirmed the widely held view the Australian deal was bad for Britain. He reinforced the need for significant reforms to how deals are delivered. The now Prime Minister himself too thought that this was a one-sided deal. So the amendments and new clauses that we have tabled would help ensure that the procurement chapters, at least, of both deals could only be implemented following serious consultation with all parts of the UK, would be subject to proper impact assessments, and only after further detailed and specific scrutiny by this House. On new clause 1,